This is part 2, the moral foundations, the backbone of ethical research. So you have just finished reading about some abhorrent cases of abuse by researchers of research participants, due not to necessarily intention to cause harm, but to obliviousness or indifference to the harm that they were causing, kind of like collateral damage in a war. So all of us can lapse into a sort of tunnel vision, losing sight of what's around us as we pursue our daily tasks and long-term goals. And there's not a one of us who is immune to this, because we can't take in everything going on around us and at the same time keep track of just one thing. We lack the cognitive capacity. We must practice it a great deal. In fact, perhaps we ourselves or you have done this. Let's say when you're driving and you have a strong intention of getting somewhere, you have a destination that you must reach, and in doing so you maybe lose your awareness of the fact that all of these other cars hold drivers that have goals that are as important to them as yours are to you, and perhaps you pass them quickly or roar by them, or you become unaware, forgetful of the fact that those are your fellow human beings. So we're all vulnerable to this, but as you know, some of these abuses were far worse. And so because of the worst that emerged when people lost awareness, that is what we saw in the last lecture of just some of the historical abuses, an external spine must be established in the form of rules that guide and direct behavior. And I'm going to liken it to a compass and say that, like this first top left image, if the internal compass in each of us was strong and infallible, always consistently directing us toward right action, we wouldn't need any rules for any of us. We would need no external guidance. And I think we all know people who have a very strong internal compass, who will take right steps and right action consistently and irrevocably. But however, time and again, our internal compass fails us. And speaking collectively as humans and even individually, there have likely been times when our internal compass has failed, and distorted by tunnel vision, by biases, and by a medley of other weaknesses like desire to reach a goal. We have to then accept that our internal compass has failed, and therefore we impose like an external compass to guide our way. So we reach the depth or the abyss of this human cruelty, resulting potentially from intention toward cruelty, and perhaps in some cases toward unawareness of what they were doing. In any event, horrendous atrocities were committed on innocent individuals who had already suffered, had already been taken from their homes, watched their family members, watched their children torn from their arms, starved, tortured, exposed to the elements in the cold with no clothes and no way to wash and very little food, alone without family in concentration camps. This is what happened to so many, many people, Jewish people, but also others who were different, like gay people, like gypsies. These are the people that the Germans were trying to eradicate. And in doing so, they placed these people into concentration camps where doctors were allowed to use them as toy things, as pawns, to answer idle, curious questions. What would happen if we, take an electrical prong and place it on this part of the body? Abhorrently cruel things with no purpose, no function. Or testing drugs that had no reason to be tested on human people, even on children. And these two short little video links, if you have the slides, you can watch them. I'm not going to show them, but this is the abyss, probably one across history of many human abysses, but within our recent history, this is one of the most abhorrent abysses of human on human cruelty. Well, there are so many to choose from, aren't there? But this one was quite horrendous because doctors were intentionally and indifferent to the fact that these were fellow human beings that they were torturing and committing experiments on. And my own grandma, who is not Jewish, but she herself even was taken across Germany in a cattle car with many other very poor people after her brothers had died and her father had tried to come to the US for safe haven. And thankfully they found a way to escape and come to the US. But this was very real in her life. She was 13 years old when they came. She did not speak any English, and she endured a great deal of struggle watching her brothers die in some of those atrocities that took place in Europe. So the Nuremberg Trials are the trials that happened after the war ended, in which the war criminals were brought to trial, and the dark underbelly of all that had been happening was exposed. Light was cast on it, and the world was horrified. It brings a tingle down my spine to even think about it, and all of humanity shuddering at what had happened in their own midst by their own people. As a German person, I myself shudder to think that it was my German people who share my heritage who were condemning their neighbors to go into these cattle cars. It was maybe my neighbors who were the doctors who eventually were torturing these people, and I still feel shame at thinking of that, my predominantly German background, as even though my people weren't there anymore at that time, my family had already escaped to the United States. Still, I shudder to think that that's my genetic background. In any case, these were the Nuremberg Trials, and from these trials, after the world had that horrifying experience, these moral principles of research were established because it became clear that we humans, all of us, even the best of us, are vulnerable to having a failure in our internal compass. And so that's why we established these principles and guidelines that we will be discussing in class today. Well, the Nuremberg Code was developed in response to that. And so there are a number of things that emerged here, and then after I discuss these, I'll show you some of the highlights. So this first bullet point is suggesting that each individual who participates in a study must know what's going on, be well informed, and volunteer to participate. Secondly, every experiment should aim at positive results for society that cannot be procured in some other way. So we can't do needless experiments. Each experiment shouldn't just be pulled out of the air. It should be based and built upon previous knowledge that justifies the experiment. So that's the literature review that you're all doing. It should be set up in a way that avoids unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injuries, or in other words, we minimize the risk to the individuals. If there is any reason, looking at number 5, to believe that it implies a risk of death or disablement, it should not be conducted. The people who are here and healthy, they can't be compromised in that way. The risks should be in proportion to the benefits, so we shouldn't have risks that are greater than the potential benefits to humanity. 7, preparations and facilities must be in place to protect the people against the risks. So if there are risks, first off, we have to have it in a way that minimizes those. And secondly, we need to take care to ensure that individuals are cared for if anything should occur. 8, the staff who conduct or take part in the experiment have to be trained and qualified. So we can't have people who don't really understand science attempting to conduct experiments. 9, every individual must be free to quit the experiment immediately at any point when they feel that need. And finally, the medical staff have to stop the experiment if they observe that there's a danger to the participants. So this is a code. And a code is like a set of guidelines. In a nutshell, this code, says we have to have qualified researchers. People have to know what they're doing, informed consent. Participants have to be free to leave, and the risk-benefit ratio must be favorable. But even after the Nuremberg Code, there continued to be wrongs that needed to be corrected. And if you're looking at the slides for this, you can play this 3-minute video about the Tuskegee Study, which you will recall from a previous lecture is the one in which poor black men were placed into a study of syphilis in which they were left untreated to give an illness to their families. They would lose organs, they would lose their lives, their wives would get the disease, and they were never told, and they were treated as if they were ants. That's the best thing I can think of, the way a child would treat ants in an anthill before he learns that they too are creatures striving to do their best in life. This resulted in this and the many other studies that we talked about, including the Milgram study that we'll look at the end of this lecture, promoted distrust. It caused people to distrust science and to distrust the scientists who were looking at them with a magnifying glass as if they were nothing but specimens. And that distrust remains with us today, and this distrust fosters some of the social problems that we still suffer. For example, distrust of doctors who might prescribe birth control causes some people to not want to take birth control, and therefore they have children when they're not ready for children, and then we have a perpetuation of maybe challenging financial states. Or distrust of doctors during the COVID pandemic caused some people to say, oh no, they're trying something on us. This can't be believed. This vaccine can't be trusted. And that resulted in many more deaths. And once a trust is violated, as happened in all of these studies, it takes a very, very long time to rebuild. And so that might be one of the worst outcomes of some of these studies that have happened, is the constant remaining distrust. And so that is why these codes and guidelines are so important. And even if it seems, as we go through this, you'll see that it can be quite a barrier and frustrating to go through so many checks of whether a study is ethical. But that is what we do. That is what we must do to pay for the failure of the internal compass in some of our earlier scientists and explorers. So the Belmont Report then is getting to a bit more systemization of this. And this was a little bit later, you can see 1976, and that was responding to, even after the Nuremberg Code, studies that took place that were harmful. All three of these we looked at, but the Milgram Obedience Study, the Stanford Prison Study, and the Tuskegee Syphilis Study all took place after the Nuremberg Code was made. And so the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research did a report. It was called the Belmont Report. And they stipulated that, number one, studies had to show respect for persons. We had to respect that people were autonomous agents. That means that they have the power, capacity, and right to act on their own behalf. And if they don't, if they're vulnerable in some way, or if they have diminished autonomy because maybe they're ill or mentally ill or disabled in some way, or maybe they're children, or maybe they're in prison, they don't have a way to act on their own behalf, then we have to go through extra means to protect them. The second principle is beneficence, that we have to minimize harms and maximize benefits. And so we do everything in the experiment to find out what we need to find out, which are the benefits, but to absolutely have as little risk to participants as possible. And thirdly, justice. We distribute the benefits and risks fairly across individuals. So let's look at these in a little more detail. So principle 1A, risks and benefits to participants, well, what things might happen to participants if they participate in the study? So the harm that could come could be physical. If you're putting them into a situation that puts them in harm's way, like giving them a new medicine or exposing them to conditions that might cause them to become ill or weak in the body, well, physical harm is a possibility. Psychological harm is a possibility. That could be like if they have to endure some sort of stress so that the scientist can observe the results of the stress, or trauma, or if participating in the experiment would cause them to have reduced self-esteem. And finally, privacy violations, if things that should be private and confidential are exposed through participating in the research. And then there are benefits that we want to play out. We might have a helpful new treatment. Say we're examining people for a condition with which many people struggle, and participating in the research can lead to a new treatment. Or maybe the benefit is just learning about ourselves, like the Milgram experiment. The opportunity is to know what we as humans might do under conditions where authority is dictating to us, contributing to scientific knowledge. So each piece of science is building on a foundational wall, building a tower of knowledge. And so contributing to that knowledge benefits humanity. And it could be something really tangible like compensation, course credit, money, food, something like that. And so you don't want the risks to outweigh the benefits as they do in this example. At the very least, you want them to balance, or ideally, the benefits outweigh the risks. So when we say risks and benefits to society and to science, well, the risks could be that the study is poorly designed, not interesting, which means that it could be a waste of time, money, and effort. Or if the research results are misunderstood or misapplied, then that could be harmful. And we might think about, say, in the field of physics, the understanding of nuclear energy led to nuclear bombs and put us into a situation that risks all of society. Or even just results that show, psychology studies that show how people can be manipulated. Well, those can be misunderstood and misapplied also. And conversely, there are benefits. We can get new medicines, vaccines, safety measures, many other things that can make the world a better place to live thanks to science. And there are benefits to science, that is building that foundational knowledge upon which other experiments can be built, and eventually these society benefits can be achieved. So principle 2, acting responsibly and with integrity. So having the character quality of being honest, reliable, and fair is what integrity is, and that leads research to have some obligations to participants, to, when conducting a study, to carry it out with care, with thoroughness, with competence, to know what you're doing, not waste their time and not risk their well-being. To meet your professional obligations in terms of sharing your research, in terms of obtaining consent, in terms of sending the information back to participants. To be truthful, and to make sure that participants are not harmed by their experience. And researchers also have obligations to science to report their findings honestly, to avoid competing interests, like avoid taking money from a drug company to test a drug, because it might lead to unethical science, acting irresponsibly or without integrity, and to be transparent, allow others to view the data, acknowledge if something goes wrong, so being transparent with your process and with your findings. So principle 3, seeking justice, what we mean by this is fairness. So the Tuskegee syphilis study was such a blatant example of unfair treatment. And in particular because it wasn't fair to the people who didn't receive treatment for the syphilis condition, and these were targeted. These were poor Black people. And so we want to always have in mind of being fair to our participants. We want to compensate them adequately for their time. We want to distribute the risks and benefits equally. So if we have a new treatment, and it proves to be helpful to participants for treating a condition, then we want to make sure individuals in the control group who didn't receive the treatment should receive it later. We avoid taking advantage of vulnerable people like children, prisoners, and people who are mentally ill. And we allow people to leave the study if they desire to do so. And finally, we respect people's rights and dignity. So we're not treating these people like specimens in a laboratory. We're respecting their autonomy to make the right to make choices and take actions without being coerced. We're not giving them undue compensation that would make them feel like they need to participate in the research. And we always tell them what's going on by giving informed consent, which is a document of people's agreement to participate in the study. We inform them of everything that might impact their decision, and then as autonomous beings, we let them make their decision. Next, you'll be going onto Blackboard to watch a video of this experiment and see about analyzing this in terms of the features we have just looked at.